Chapter 17. "I'm showing several forms moving at high speed towards the APC, Billie said. Her mouth was dry. In spite of the heat, she felt cold all over. The blips on the screen wavered and jumped, moved closer. "I guess that means Ripley's plan is working," she said. Wilks didn't spare her a glance as he wrestled with the controls. "Reactor halfway to critical. APC's about to be overcome by superbugs. Yeah, I'd say it's working. Any better, and we could blow our brains out now and save those bastards the trouble." "Should I call the Kurtz again?" "Not yet. We give Ripley her 5+ and keep going till this sucker suffers from a complete engine or axle lock." "Then?" She turned to look at him. Her vision was blurred from sweat. "Haven't gotten that far yet," he said. The APC rocked. Billie looked back at the sensor and then screamed. "Jesus," said Wilks. A giant, dripping alien grin appeared on the other side of the clear steel. The creature lifted huge, clawed hands up to the window, and with a muffled shriek, plunged its head through the shield. The clear metal shattered inward, sprayed everywhere, as the alien reached for Billie. Ripley fell into the shallow water, grunted, and jumped up into a crouch. She tried to look in all directions at once, managed one. There was no immediate danger. She didn't believe that the drones would have left their queen unprotected, but the only motion around her was the gentle swaying ocean. Doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. All of her senses were in overdrive. The putrid odor of the planet, combined with the heat and gravity, made her dizzy. Along with the fading sound of the APC, there was only the slosh of water against her legs. The fierce winds had suddenly dwindled to almost nothing. An alien's cry echoed through the dead air, but it came from the direction of the retreating transport. She turned and faced the cluster of nests. "It's just you and me now," she said. Wilks grabbed for his weapon. The creature already had its claws on Billie. It hissed, its decayed breath filling the air as Wilks came up with his carbine. Everything was mired in time, creaking forward in slow motion and thick gravity. Too late, his brain chanted. The explosion thundered in his ears. The drone seemed to fly backward with a cry of rage and pain. Acid splattered, bubbled, and smoked on the shards of clear steel. Adcox stepped forward, weapon extended. The alien was gone. "Oh, shit," said Billie. "Are you okay?" said Adcox. Billie looked down at her ripped shirt and then back at the lieutenant. "Yeah." Wilks exhaled heavily and checked the motion sensor. "One down," he said. Hot, noxious air washed over them. Billie had a small cut on her left arm from the clear steel, but that was it. That they hadn't been drenched with the bug's acid was amazing. Time to think about it later, Wilks told himself. He glanced at the APC readout to see the core temperature still rising. "Keep your eye on that thing," he said. If there is a later, he thought. Ripley slowly splashed towards the orbs. She heard shots in the distance. "Bet we got one of your babies," she said. Her muscles were sore from the gravity. It felt like 100 kilos had been strapped to each limb. Even breathing was an effort. But she could feel the queen, the powerful aura of the bitch. Water splashed behind her. Ripley spun, raised her weapon. The drone was still 20 meters away. It screamed, opened its jaws. Ripley pulled the trigger, fired a quick burst at the massive target's chest. The running creature stopped dead, its abdomen peeled outward by the explosive force of the rounds. It fell into the water, hissing like a punctured air tank. The wave motion rocked Ripley's legs, and she fought to maintain balance. The noise of the shots hurt her ears. Should have worn plugs. Another shriek to her left. She turned again. This one was closer and moved at an incredible speed, even in the heavy gravity. She fired twice. The giant alien fell backward, its taloned feet in the air for a second before it rolled over. The thing's jointed tail flailed up and then lashed into the water before it lay still. Speckles of liquid splashed Ripley's face. She crouched for a minute and listened. Only the sizzle of alien blood as it dispersed into the water. She faced the nest. "Is that the best you can do?" she said, breathing hard. "Those are your chosen protectors?" Silence. "Why don't you show yourself?" Ripley whacked the arm of her mechanical suit against one of the connecting cords. It rippled and swayed slightly. She felt a bitter anger rise up. "What the fuck is this? Why don't you come out here and tell me?" She hit the cord again and moved closer to the center orb. "Explain the crew of the Nostromo, the Sulaco. Explain Earth. Explain my daughter, you bitch!" Ripley waited, breathing hard. Suddenly, the huge sphere jerked. The translucent goo quivered. A long crack appeared at the top of the thing, pulsing slightly. It started opening. Ripley tapped her comm, never taking her eyes off the nest. "Kurtz, this is Ripley," she said quickly. "Zero my position and get your asses here." Brewster's fuzzy voice spoke into her ear. "I told Wilks, the wind has died down. Get that ship over my coordinates now." As she spoke, a blackness started to move up from the orb. A glossy, elongated shape, a skull easily 2 meters in length, raised up. 3 clawed digits wrapped over the lip of the crack, and then another 3. The Queen slowly pulled herself up. She hissed at Ripley, drool falling from her jaws, as she unfurled herself from her home. The Queen, the mama of all mamas, come to receive her visitor. She was at least 8 meters long, her whipping, bony tail making her 8 more. Her comb was sleek and wet. Several of her vertebrae arched outward like spines, ran down her back like a row of fingers. She had 4 arms. She was the biggest living creature Ripley had ever seen, taller than the elephant she'd seen in the zoo as a kid. Jesus. The Queen ducked her head forward and down, craned her obscene skull to get a better look at what had disturbed her. "That's right," said Ripley. She backed away from the advancing creature. "Come on out and have a look." "Core temperatures going up. Meltdown in 7 minutes," said Billie. Her body was still shaking, but she had managed to control the worst of it. "We're talking more than a meltdown," said Wilks. "When that core burned through to the liquid fuel chamber, we're looking at an explosion." "Gee, and everything's been going great so far," Char said. Wilks pushed at the controls and then sighed. "Well, the engine and the wheels still work," he said. "That means this thing probably keeps rolling until it blows. Time to leave this party. We'll have to make the drop site on foot." "That's fucked," Char said. "Take all the ammunition you can carry and move out. Unless you want to cook here." "New readings at the outer perimeter," Billie said. She squinted at the motion sensor and then tapped the side of it, hard. "There's a wall of them, Wilks!" Even as she spoke, a dozen or so lights flashed on the screen. "What?" Char said. "They're running past us." "Mama is calling her children," Wilks said. Billie could barely fathom the number of moving creatures it would take to give that reading. "There must be thousands," she said. Her stomach knotted tighter. "Ripley." "She'll do what she has to do," said Wilks. He stood and walked to the back. Billie and Char both looked through the open shield for a few seconds, the choking air fetid against their faces. The army of drones moved towards them like a sheet of rain, closer and closer. Dozens ran past the APC, headed back to the Queen. Billie could hear their shrieks over the rising whine of the transport. "It's almost certain suicide to get out," Char said. "And what happened to the nice breeze we had?" "We know it's suicide to stay," Billie said. "Maybe the bastards are on autopilot or something, and they won't even notice us." Without another word, they walked back to Falk and Wilks. The two men handed them loaded weapons and extra magazines. They all moved to the rear hatch. "Conserve ammo," said Wilks, "and fire only at targets coming at us. Stay close." Billie searched for something to say, some last words, but there was nothing. Wilks hit the button and jumped, slipped, landed on his shoulder with a splash. A chorus of howls went up around the APC as Billie took a breath and leaped. Ripley continued to back away from the hissing Queen. It seemed like a long fucking time before she heard a noise that drowned the bitch out. The sound of the Kurtz moving in overhead was sweet music. "We'll bring her in as low as we can," crackled Brewster through her comm. "And then... holy shit!" "Quite the prize," said Ripley. "Open the containment chamber and get close to me." "Yeah," said Brewster. "But if that wind picks up again..." The Queen refocused her attention on the thundering ship. She backed away from Ripley a step and let out a high-pitched, mewling noise. "Pretty ship," said Ripley. "See the nice, pretty ship." She darted her gaze quickly to the descending Kurtz and then back to the Queen. "Bitch wanna go for a ride on the pretty ship?" The Queen didn't offer a reply. "Closer, Brewster! Come on!" The Queen took another step backward, wagged her huge head, looked at Ripley, then the ship. The Kurtz's cargo bay was directly over her, the hatch open. Keeping her weapon pointed at the Queen, Ripley held her other arm up. The clamp on the suit opened and then closed on metal. She pulled herself up. It took a tremendous effort. Her arm felt like it was going to jerk out of its socket, even with the suit's augmentation. The alien watched, but didn't try to follow her. As big as the ship was, Ripley couldn't believe the monster was afraid. Curious, perhaps, but the goddamn things never seemed to be afraid of anything. Ripley sidled into the dock on her elbows, scrambled forward on her knees. She stood and looked down at the Queen. The creature hissed at her. All of her metallic teeth glinted wetly in the dim light. Ripley smiled. "Perfect, Brewster. Hold here for a minute." She retrained her weapon at the closest orb and fired. The Queen screamed as pieces of her nest flew. Ripley kept the trigger depressed, sent a steady stream of bullets into the orb. Bits of the weird, fleshy material dropped into the water and sank. She released the trigger. The Queen turned from the remains of her broken home and howled in anger. She looked at Ripley. She knows I'm doing it, Ripley thought. Knows what a gun is, even though she's never seen one before. Well, watch this. Ripley aimed at the next orb and opened fire. With a shriek, the Queen leaped at her. Ripley stumbled backward as the Queen extended her huge clawed hands towards the slick alloy. The Queen grasped at the edge of the door's frame and caught hold. "Up! Now! Up!" Ripley screamed into the comm. The curtains lifted. The Queen pulled herself into the dock as Ripley ran towards the inner door. "Seal the outer hatch!" The Queen screamed a sound of absolute fury as she started towards Ripley. Ripley spun back to look at the Queen and the nearly closed hatch. She had to be sure. The Queen's dark tail lashed out and the tip of it reached Ripley by the door. It thrashed down, thumped against the protecting bars of the Meccano's suit, bent the metal and stacked carbon fibers, smashed into Ripley's skull. The force of the blow knocked her sprawling. The chamber washed out. Tiny bursts of light flashed around the howling alien. Ripley shook her head as the Queen turned away from her, leaped at the hatch, and pounded on it. The trapped monster screamed for her freedom. The shrill sound faded as Ripley scrabbled backward, and the world went to grey. Wilks, Billie, Adcox and Falk stood in a circle and faced outward. Scores of the drones loped past them, without stopping, splashed through the shallow water towards their mother. If the cloying, chemical stench of rot, the heavy air and the heat weren't bad enough, hundreds of the nightmare creatures streamed past them, making it closer to hell than Wilks had ever thought he'd see. Someone fired from behind him. Aliens screamed and hissed and kept running. One of the drones veered towards him, reached out, claws hooked. Wilks squeezed the trigger and sprayed the alien with a short burst. The thing fell into the water. 3 or 4 of the bugs stumbled over the dead creature, but kept running. Another monster howled, lunged at Wilks. He fired again. Falk cursed steadily behind him, as more of the creatures stopped and were killed. Wilks knew they would never make the drop site. There was no way they could move amidst the army of mindless bugs and keep themselves covered. He aimed at one of the grinning drones as it looked in their direction, and he squeezed off a single round. The alien's head exploded. It collapsed into the water, which bubbled madly now with the acidic blood of its brothers. "We're not going to make it!" Billie shouted. Wilks pointed his weapon at another one and fired. "5 more minutes and the APC will detonate," he called back. "We'll fucking take them with us." He squeezed the trigger over and over and hoped that their ammo would last until the white heat of the APC ended it all. The Queen's tail lashed at Ripley's leg, slapped it hard enough to move the pain from her head. Her eyes snapped open. She had crumpled against the wall next to the door when... "My head," she thought. The Queen still thrashed wildly at the outer hatch, but it wasn't giving. Ripley hit the button that would get her out of danger. The door into the APC bay slid open. At the sound, the Queen turned. With her tail coiled behind her, she prepared to leap. Ripley fell into the clean air of the dock and jerked her legs after her. Moto stood there, welder in hand. "Quick!" Moto slammed the control. The door closed a split second before the Queen barreled into it. A muffled pounding started on the other side, but the reinforced metal held. Ripley leaned against the wall and watched Moto seal the entry. She never thought she would think the canned air of the ship was sweet, but it was. She was alive. And the Queen was hers. Going for a ride, bitch. McQuaid stepped forward and helped Ripley pull off the leggings of the suit. Christo, Ripley, you did it, he said. Ripley winced as he pulled the metal boot off her left leg. Yeah, hurry, we have to get to the others. Moto finished the door and stood. She and McQuaid exchanged a look. Can't, said McQuaid. Brewster says we're getting the hell out of here. What are you talking about? Said Ripley. They're dead? She suddenly felt dizzy and pressed a hand to her forehead. No, the APC's gone critical. It'll blow in a few minutes. The squad's pinned down in one of the narrow valleys, and Brewster says it's too tight for a pickup. Ripley ran to the stairs before McQuaid finished. Moto and the captain followed. She clambered up, ignored her body's mute cries of pain as she climbed into the control room. Brewster and Tully sat at the controls, expressions grim. Ripley, said Brewster, glad you're... Get to those people now! Look, there's no way. I wish to God there was, but the wind is rising. There's no goddamn room and no time. Find a way, she said. If we die, we die. What if it was you down there? Brewster frowned. Listen, he began. No, you listen. You take it back or I will. She was still in the top half of the suit, and the servos whined as she snapped the grippers shut. He blew out a big breath. Fuck it. He nodded. Okay, he said. Hold on. Less than 100 rounds here, Char yelled. Falk cursed and threw his weapon down. Ah, dry! Billie moved closer to him and covered. Her head ached and pounded with the endless sound of explosions and shrieks. The air beat down on her. The world had become screams and death, and it was too much trouble just to stand up. She hoped Ripley had made it, that it wasn't all for nothing. She felt tears roll down her cheeks. A huge emptiness opened inside her gut as she took out another of the slavering aliens. She had been here before, and she hadn't gotten used to it, but she wasn't as afraid as she had been the last time. Fuck it. The creatures suddenly scattered, backed away from their small group. Hundreds of them howled at once, reached their arms up to the sky. It was deafening. Billie turned to Wilks, confused. He pointed upward, a tight grin on his scarred face. The Kurtz. She hadn't heard the engines, her ears overwhelmed with the alien shrieks and gunfire. Wilks grabbed her roughly, jerked her from under the drop path of the approaching ship. The aliens screamed, ran towards the descending vessel, knocked into them at chest level. Char fell, but Falk caught her. Wilks kept an arm around Billie and leaned into the wave. He fired at a drone that ran towards them. The APC bay door was open. Ripley and Moto stood on either side of the dock, holding on to metal struts. They pointed weapons past the four of them and fired continuously. Billie and Wilks ran towards the dock. Billie saw Ripley, was relieved to see she was okay. But then Ripley's mouth formed into a scream. As they stumbled into the bay, Billie looked over her shoulder. The aliens were running into the suppressive fire and falling to the sides of the ship by the score. Falk was right behind them, but one of the drones had grabbed Char. She had fallen forward, with an alien right behind her, and in some vicious parody of sex, it pushed against her, shoved her face into the water. Billie saw it plunge a claw through the back of Char's neck, watched it force her head back up. Her blood was startlingly red against the grey water. Her head flopped to the side, hung by shreds of her flesh. The alien's cry of triumph was short as bullets cut it in half. But Charlene Adcox was dead. Hundreds of the drones threw themselves at the closing lock as Ripley and Moto hosed their fire through the narrowing gap. Just before it shut completely, a lunging creature struck one clawed hand into the bay. The lock cycled shut, and two of the drone's fingers off. They sizzled and hissed on the floor of the ship, burned smoking craters into the flooring. They were all pressed to the floor of the dock as the ship suddenly bounced and rocketed upward. "Brace yourself! The APC will blow in a few seconds!" Ripley yelled. The words sounded far away. Wilks had hooked one arm around a metal beam and held tightly to Billie with the other. Billie didn't hear the explosion, but the ship rocked violently around them. It tilted to one side, yawed impossibly. Billie and Wilks crashed sidelong into the wall. And then it was over. The Kurtz straightened itself, smoothed out. Only the drone of the engines broke the silence. Billie took a huge gulp of air and began to sob against Wilks's chest. He stroked her hair gently and didn't let go. "It's okay. We made it. It's okay." Once again, they had outrun death.